Day my brother got the house on Maple Lake and I got a print shop full of broken equipment and 40 years of someone else's paperwork, my wife looked at me across the dinner table and said, "Well, that figures." She didn't say it mean. That was almost worse. She said it the way you'd say of course. It rained on the one day I forgot my umbrella, like my life was a small, predictable inconvenience. My father had been gone 3 weeks. I hadn't even finished grieving him yet. My brother, I'll call him my brother, because that's what he was, legally and by blood, though by the end of this I had to remind myself of that fact, had been the golden one since we were boys in Dayton. He was the one who gave the toast at every family dinner, the one who called Dad every Sunday, the one who showed up to things with a bottle of good wine and a story that made everyone laugh. I was the one who showed up. There's a difference. I understand that now. The will was read in a lawyer's office on a Tuesday morning in March. My brother sat across from me in a grey suit he'd clearly bought recently. I wore the sport coat I'd had since my daughter's wedding. My wife was there too, sitting beside me with her hands folded, already doing the math in her head. I could tell by the stillness of her. She went very still when she was calculating. My father had built something modest, a house in Columbus that sold years ago, some savings that went mostly to my stepmother, and 2 properties he'd held on to from his working years. The lake house in Michigan, which he'd bought in 1987 and which was worth by that point somewhere around $400,000, and a commercial print shop in a small industrial strip outside of Akron, the one he'd run himself from 1978 until his knees gave out in 2004, after which he'd leased it to a series of tenants, none of whom had stayed long. My brother got the lake house. I got the print shop. My brother tried not to smile. He mostly succeeded. My wife didn't say anything until we were in the car. Then she said, "He gave him the lake house." I said I knew. She said, "That property is worth 4 times what that shop is worth. You know that." I said I knew that too. She was quiet for a while, and then she said, "Your father never did think much of your potential." She said it gently, like a diagnosis. I didn't argue with her. I was 63 years old, and I had been married to this woman for 31 years, and I had learned that arguing in the car about my dead father's opinion of my potential was not a road that led anywhere good. So I watched the highway and I thought about my father, and I tried to remember the last time he and I had talked about something that wasn't logistical. The print shop was about 90 minutes from where we live. I drove out there the following Saturday, alone. I want to tell you what it looked like, because it matters. It was a low beige building, maybe 4,000 square feet, sitting on a corner lot at the end of a row of light industrial units, an auto parts supplier, a powder coating outfit, a place that did embroidery for sports teams. The sign above my father's shop still said Harmon Commercial Printing in faded blue letters, though Harmon was my grandfather's name and my father had never bothered to change it after he inherited it. The parking lot had weeds coming up through the asphalt in long diagonal cracks. The front windows had that dusty gray film you get when a building hasn't been looked at in a while. Inside was worse. The last tenant had left in a hurry. There were boxes of half-finished jobs stacked against one wall, a commercial offset press that hadn't run in years, and on every flat surface paper, folders and binders and flat cardboard boxes sealed with tape that had gone brittle. The kind of accumulation you get when a man runs a business for 26 years and never throws anything away. I stood in the middle of it and thought, my brother is at the lake house right now. Then I thought, I need to find out if this building is worth anything. My wife had already looked it up. By the time I got home that evening, she had the county auditor's assessed value pulled up on her laptop. She turned the screen toward me without saying anything. The assessed value was $84,000. The last time the property had sold to my grandfather in 1961, the price had been $11,000. It's not even the building, she said. It's the lot. That whole area is depressed. Nobody wants industrial property in a depressed corridor. I asked her what she thought I should do. She shrugged. Sell it for whatever you can get. Don't put money into it. I didn't sell it. I'm not sure why exactly. Stubbornness, maybe. A feeling I couldn't articulate, that there was something in that building I hadn't seen yet. My father had held on to it for 20 years after he stopped running it. He could have sold it. He chose not to. I wanted to know why. My brother called me about 2 weeks later. He'd been doing what my brother always did, moving fast, talking to people, generating energy. He'd already had the lake house appraised, already been in contact with a real estate agent, already, and this is the part that caught me off guard, already found a developer who was interested in the print shop property. Wait, I said, the print shop is mine. He said he knew that. He said he was just passing along information. The developer was putting together a mixed-use project in that corridor, apartments above, retail below, and they were assembling parcels. My lot was one of 3 they needed. How much? I asked. He told me. It was more than I expected, but less than the lake house was worth. And there was something in the way he said it, the way he'd already talked to the developer, already had the number ready, that made me slow down. I told him I'd think about it. Then I drove back out to Akron. I don't know what I was looking for. I spent most of that day going through the boxes. Old invoices, supplier catalogs from the 90s, tax files going back to 1981. My father was meticulous about paper in a way he was never meticulous about anything else. Every file had a label. Every label had a year. The binders were organized by category, vendors, clients, leases, government, miscellaneous. I opened the one marked government, mostly because it seemed like it would be boring and boring felt manageable. It was thicker than I expected. The first few folders were the usual: business licenses, zoning correspondence, an EPA compliance form from 1993 related to ink solvent disposal, and then near the back, a folder labeled Federal Ore Agreement 1989. Row, right of way. I almost set it aside. Instead, I opened it. What I found was a 20-page document on Department of Transportation letterhead, signed by my grandfather in August of 1989, executed 6 months before he died and 2 years before my father formally inherited the business. It was a right-of-way agreement granting the federal government access to a subsurface corridor running beneath the northeast corner of the property. A utility conduit, it said, for fiber optic infrastructure related to a federal communications modernization project. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I read the compensation terms. The agreement specified an annual payment of $18,000, indexed to inflation, payable quarterly, in perpetuity, for the duration of the conduit's active use. There was a clause requiring written notification to the property owner before any modification or termination. There was a clause specifying that the agreement transferred automatically to any successor in ownership, as long as the property remained in commercial or mixed-use classification. I set the folder down and sat on the concrete floor with my back against the old press and thought about what I just read. $18,000 a year, indexed to inflation, meaning by now, 35 years later, it was likely worth considerably more, meaning whoever owned this property was entitled to those payments, meaning my father had been receiving them or had been entitled to receive them this entire time. I called the number on the letterhead the next morning. It took 4 transfers and about 40 minutes on hold before I reached someone in the right department. She confirmed the agreement was still active. The conduit was part of a federal broadband backbone that had been continuously in use since installation. She told me the current annual payment rate. It was not $18,000. It was $61,200. Paid quarterly, automatically, to the owner of record. I asked her who was currently listed as the owner of record for payment purposes. She said the files still showed my father's name. She said the payments had been going into an account that had been inactive since 2019, which was when my father's health had started declining, and apparently when he'd stopped actively managing his affairs. She said there was a backlog of unclaimed payments in escrow. I asked how large the backlog was. She put me on hold again. When she came back, she said, "Sir, the amount currently held in escrow for this agreement is $247,000. I wrote the number down on the back of a client invoice from 1987. I wrote it carefully, the way you write something you're not sure you read correctly. Then I sat in that building for a long time. I didn't call my wife. I thought about it and decided not to. I'm not proud of that decision, and I'm not going to explain it as strategy or calculation, because it wasn't either of those things. It was instinct. The same instinct that had made me drive out there alone in the first place. I wasn't ready to hand this to someone else to evaluate. I called my daughter instead. She had always been the one I talked to when I needed to think out loud without being judged. She was 34, a project manager at a logistics firm in Pittsburgh, and she had a quality I've always admired. She could hear complicated information without immediately deciding what it meant. I told her what I'd found. All of it. The agreement, the annual repayments, the escrow account. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dad, have you told anyone else?" I said, "No." She said, "Okay, don't yet. Let me call someone." The someone she called was her husband's uncle, who practiced real estate and estate law in Cleveland. He drove out to the shop that Thursday. He was a careful, quiet man in his late 50s who wore reading glasses on a cord around his neck and who read the entire 20-page document without saying a word. When he finished, he said, "This is legitimate." He said the agreement was what's called a permanent easement with compensation, a relatively uncommon arrangement, more common with private utility companies than federal agencies, but entirely enforceable. He said the transfer clause was clear and unambiguous. He said that as the inheritor of the property, I was entitled to all future payments and with proper documentation to the escrowed backlog as well. He also said something else. He said, "You should know that if you were to sell this property to a developer or anyone else, this easement would need to be disclosed, and depending on how the purchase agreement was structured, you might be signing away your rights to the ongoing payments." I asked him what the ongoing payments were worth, capitalized over a reasonable time horizon. He thought about it. He said, conservatively somewhere between $700,000 and $1 million, depending on how long the federal infrastructure remained active and whether the property maintained its commercial classification. I drove home. My brother called that night. He said the developer had a timeline. He said they needed an answer by the end of the month. He said, and I remember this clearly because of the way he said it, the way he'd been saying things my whole life, like a man who was managing a situation. He said, "I just want to make sure you're not leaving money on the table by overthinking this." I said I appreciated that. He asked if I'd made a decision. I said not yet. He said, "Look, I'm going to be honest with you. That shop isn't worth what they're offering on its own merits. They're buying the parcel for the development. You're not going to get another offer like this." I said, "I know." He said, "So what are you waiting for?" I said I was still reviewing some documents. There was a pause. Then he said, "What documents?" I told him there was some paperwork from Dad's files I wanted to understand before I made any decisions. I kept my voice neutral. I'd spent 63 years being the less interesting brother. I knew how to be neutral. The escrow transfer took 6 weeks and required more paperwork than I'd done in the previous decade combined. The attorney handled most of it. By mid-June, $247,000 had been transferred to a new account in my name. The ongoing payments were restructured to come directly to me on a quarterly basis. The first quarterly payment was $15,300. I did not sell the property to the developer. What I did instead was hire a property manager, a woman my daughter found through her professional network experienced with commercial leases, and we put the building back on the rental market. Within 3 months, we had a tenant, a small packaging company that needed light industrial space close to a distribution hub. The lease covered my property taxes, insurance, and management fees, with money left over. I didn't tell my wife about any of it for a while, not because I was hiding it from her. I knew I'd have to tell her eventually, and I knew I would. But I needed time to understand what I had before I put it in front of someone who would immediately start deciding what to do with it. When I finally told her it was a Sunday evening in July, I sat down at the kitchen table with the folder and I walked her through it. The agreement, the escrow, the ongoing payments, the tenant lease. She was very still for a long time. Then she said, "Your father knew about this." I said I thought so, yes. I thought he'd received the payments for years before his health declined. I thought maybe, and this was the thing I kept coming back to, maybe he'd left me the shop because of the agreement. Not as a consolation prize, as the better inheritance. She said, "He should have told you." I said, "Maybe." Or maybe he thought I'd find it. He knew how I worked. He knew how I was the one who read the documents. He was not a sentimental man, my father, but he knew his sons. My wife was quiet again. Then she said, I said some things at dinner, after the will was read. I said I remembered. She said I shouldn't have said them. I told her I knew she was disappointed. I told her I understood it. She said, that's not an excuse. I said no, it wasn't. I don't think it's my place to tell you how things resolve between my wife and me, because that's still unfolding and it's private in a way that the rest of this isn't. What I can tell you is that I'm still in the house I've lived in for 22 years. I'm still married. Those facts mean something, and they also don't mean everything. My brother found out about the easement in September when the developer's title search turned up the encumbrance and the deal collapsed. He called me. It was a short conversation. He asked me why I hadn't told him. I said I hadn't known when he and I first talked. He said, but you found out before the deadline. I said yes. He said, and you didn't say anything. I said no. There was a long silence. Then he said, Dad left that to you on purpose, didn't he? It wasn't really a question. I said I thought so. He didn't say anything after that. I heard him breathe for a moment, and then the call ended. We've talked twice since then. Once about a cousin's health situation, once about Thanksgiving logistics. It's civil. It's not what it was, but then, what it wasn't fully honest either, and maybe civil and honest is a better starting point than warm and false. My daughter came to visit in October. We sat on the back porch in the evening and she asked me how I was feeling about all of it. I thought about it. I said I felt like I'd been handed something my father trusted me to find, and that I'd found it, and that felt like enough. She said, he was proud of you, you know. I said I was starting to think so. The print shop is still standing. The beige paint is still faded, and the parking lot still has those long diagonal cracks, and Harman Commercial Printing is still written in blue letters above the door, even though there's a packaging company inside now, and my grandfather has been dead for over 30 years. I haven't changed the sign. I keep meaning to, and then I don't. There's something about the name on the building that I'm not ready to let go of yet. Every 3 months a payment comes in. I open the notification on my phone and I look at the number and I think about my father in that building for 26 years, running jobs, keeping files, labeling every folder by year. I think about him holding onto the property long after it stopped making practical sense. And I think about him sitting with a lawyer drafting his will, deciding which son got what. He knew I would read the documents. He knew I would sit with the confusion long enough to find the answer. He just didn't know how long I'd have to sit on the floor of that building before I figured it out. Some inheritances skip a generation, some skip a personality type. Mine found me right on time. I keep coming back to the image of my father labeling those folders. Every year, every category, every document filed in its place. He wasn't a warm man in the way people mean when they say warm. He didn't hug easily or say things out loud that he could show you instead. But he was precise, and I think precision for him was a form of love. What I've come to understand is that nothing about what happened to me was accidental, not the outcome and not the path that led there. My brother moved fast his whole life and was rewarded for it over and over until one day the speed itself became the liability. He talked to a developer before he talked to me. He assumed he understood the value of something he'd never bothered to examine. That's not a character flaw I enjoy pointing out. It's just what happens when a man has spent decades being told his instincts are correct. You stop checking. I spent those same decades being told the opposite. And somewhere along the way, the doubt that could have broken me became a habit of looking twice, of sitting with a document until I understood it, of not accepting the first number someone handed me as the final word. I didn't learn that from a book or a mentor. I learned it from being the brother who didn't get the benefit of the doubt, who had to actually verify things because no one was going to vouch for me if I got it wrong. That's not bitterness, I want to be clear about that. It's closer to gratitude, though it took me a long time to recognize it as such. My daughter once asked me, somewhere in the middle of all this, whether I was angry at my wife for what she'd said at that dinner table. I thought about it honestly. I said no, not anymore. Because what she said came from a real place. even if it was unkind. She'd built her sense of security around a certain vision of what success looked like, and I hadn't matched it. That was a failure of imagination on her part, maybe, but it was also a failure of communication on mine. I had spent 31 years being quietly capable without ever making it visible. You can't fault someone entirely for not seeing what you never showed them. What I showed her in July when I sat down with that folder wasn't a windfall. It was evidence of a way of moving through the world, slowly, carefully, with enough patience to sit on a concrete floor in a building that smelled like ink and dust until something revealed itself. That quality doesn't photograph well. It doesn't make for a good toast at a family dinner, but it compounds over time in ways that faster-moving people don't always anticipate. My father knew that about me. I believe that now. He left me the harder inheritance, the one that required something from me before it gave anything back. And in doing so, he told me, in the only language he ever really spoke fluently, that he trusted me to find it. Some things only reveal themselves to the people willing to stay long enough to look.